Alan Cash, welcome to the Keto Camp podcast.
Thank you very much, Ben.
So I was just telling you offline, I came across your work through my mentor, Dr. Pampa, who my audience are very much familiar with. He's been on my show several times, and he did a great interview with you on oxaloacetate and your product Benagine, and that got me really fascinated with it, and I started taking it, and we're going to dive deep into some of the cool research you're doing. But before we get into that, how did you even stumble across this molecule, Alan?
Well, stumble is a good word.
Literally, huh?
You can't be good, be lucky. I got sick. It happens to all of us at some point in time, and I had a condition where it was essentially caused by aging, and I was very fortunate they were able to fix the problem through brain surgery. But it made me wonder as a physicist why we age. What can we do about it? And unfortunately, there's not a lot. One of the things when I did a big overview of the aging scenario, the only thing I found at that time, which was in the early 2000s, was calorie restriction. That's where you eat about 25% less than you normally would. And when we do that to animals, they live about 25% longer. And it was very weird. It was first discovered early on in the 1930s, I think, at Cornell University. And who would have thought that if you give an animal less energy, that they'd live longer? I mean, it's not intuitive at all. So we started looking at the pathways of calorie restriction as far as energy production at UCSD at the Williams lab, and what we saw was really interesting. At that time, Sinclair and Lenny Garante at MIT, Dave Sinclair at Harvard, were doing a bunch of work with worms. And they saw that if they increased the NAD to NADH ratio, these worms were living longer. And they were proving that up with genetic manipulation, which I looked at that and I thought, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So I started looking for compounds that would change the NAD to NADH ratio. And NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, which is why we call it NAD, because imagine saying that in every sentence.
It's a mouthful.
Oh my gosh. And what they are is they're an energy currency. It allows an electron to go back and forth, and this helps to drive reactions in your body, in every cell of your body. So in looking through the metabolic pathways, specifically the energy pathways, we identified two compounds. Oxaloacetate was one of them, and it was funny. I'm not a biologist, so I went over to a friend of mine who is a top level biologist. He's now at UCLA, and I sat down in his office and I said, I came up with this idea where we could change the NAD to NADH ratio using oxaloacetate, and here are the papers that support that and why we want to do that. And he just looked at me like, and then without saying a word, he stood up and walked out of his office. And I thought, oh my God, I've really embarrassed myself here. And then he poked his head back in the office and said, well, come on. And I got up and followed him downstairs, and he went to this big steel door and took out a big key ring and opened up the steel door. And behind that was a huge laboratory. And this was his lab. And he went over to one of the benches and just took his arm and just like moved everything aside and said, this is your spot. And I said, what are you talking about? He goes, well, we'll try it. I mean, how do you know unless you try it? And I said, well, I'm not a biologist. And he said, how tough can it be? We'll get a bunch of flies. We'll feed them oxaloacetate, and they'll either be feet up or feet down, and you'll count them, and you'll see if they live longer. Um, so we ended up starting with little worms, C. elegans, because the genetics are a little bit better known in them. We can follow along in some of the pathways because they're a lot simpler than flies. Flies are actually fairly complex. And I started counting worms and learning how to raise worms on little petri dishes. My wife thought I had gone insane, and but everybody should have a hobby. So then we started adding in oxaloacetate to these worms, and they live longer. And the guy I was working with said, "Okay, I'm going to put a couple of postdocs on this." And they repeated my work, and they saw the same thing. So then the question started. Okay, well maybe oxaloacetate, maybe they don't like the taste of it, and so they eat less, and that would be another way to calories. So we had to film these worms as they were eating along the plate, and then count the number of times that they ate something, and it turned out they actually ate just a little bit more than the control group, and yet they still lived about 25% longer. There was another scientist that repeated some of my work. Instead of doing it on agar plates, they did it in a water bath with these worms, and they got up to a 50% increase in lifespan. So that was kind of cool.
Wow.
And so we published that.
Yeah, didn't you cry when you saw those results? Didn't you cry?
I I did. I mean, it was pretty cool. You don't extend
Yeah.
lifespan of a species very often, and it was funny. Dave Sinclair actually came to our lab, and it was funny. It was very early on, and we showed him the work in worms, and he goes, "Wow!" And then we did some work in flies, and wow. And then we showed him the work in mice. He was, wow. He goes, "You've joined the club," and I was like, "Oh, I didn't know there was a club." So it was kind of fun, and
That's a great club to be in.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's fun. And then we tried to figure out why, what was exactly going on. So we started ordering worms from Worm Base, where you can have one of the genes disabled. Pretty cool resource. And we did that, and then repeated the experiments and saw which ones lived longer and which ones didn't. And the ones that didn't live longer, we knew that disabling that gene, you know, that told us something. So we finally figured out that we were putting the oxaloacetate in. It was going and breaking down into something called malate, which is another metabolite, and it was doing that through an enzyme called malate dehydrogenase. And as part of that reaction, it was taking NADH and turning it into NAD plus. So it was changing the redox. And I wasn't the first person who thought of that. That the first person who thought of that was actually a guy named Hans Krebs, who's the Krebs cycle is named after him. And in 1968, he published a paper showing that if you put oxaloacetate into these cells, it increases the NAD to NADH ratio by 900% in 2 minutes. That's
Wow.
that's huge. That's huge. Very powerful. So
Can you explain why that it's important to create that ratio? Like, what is the benefit of having that ratio increase that way?
Well, it turns out that it's called the redox of the cell. And when you change the redox of the cell, various proteins turn on and turn off. So one of them is AMP protein activated kinase, or AMPK. Again, we say AMPK because we want to have a conversation that doesn't last a
Easier.
century. And in turning on AMPK, that does a lot of different things. That actually changes the gene expression of the cell towards a more calorie restricted gene expression. So decreasing the NAD to NADH ratio is like eating a bunch of McDonald's supersized hamburgers. If you want to go the other way and do a little bit of calorie restriction, you want to increase the NAD to NADH ratio. So we were figuring out the basic signaling pathway that's responsible for the changes we see in calorie restriction, and one of those changes is increasing in lifespan. So, that's you don't get that many other ways. Increasing AMPK does other things, or activating AMPK. The drug metformin does this, and that helps with people that have diabetes to lower their fasting glucose levels. So one of the things we looked at when we did see this increase in lifespan is has anyone ever given oxaloacetate to a human being? And it turns out in the 1960s in Japan, they did a clinical trial in diabetics with oxaloacetate, with type 1 and type 2 diabetics. And across the board, they found that it lowered fasting glucose levels and did not have any side effects. And I thought, wow, here's a natural human compound that lowers fasting glucose levels in type 1 and type 2 diabetics. Why doesn't everyone know about this? Um, and there are a couple reasons. I actually flew to Japan to try to unravel that mystery, and met with
Wow.
the department that put out the paper. The actual author had passed away because it was from the 1960s, but they were familiar with the paper. I held it up and I said, "Is this your paper?" And they said, "Yes, that's our paper. Who are you?" And luckily they spoke English much better than I spoke Japanese. And I said, "Well, I flew over from the United States to see if you knew about this paper." And they said, "Yeah, we our department prepared that paper." And I said, "There was no follow-on work, and I haven't been able to find anything." And they said, "No, there was no follow-on work." And I said, "Did someone die?" And they said, "No, no, no, no." They said, "It's a natural compound." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's a natural human compound. It's in every cell of our body. We just have to give it a little bit more." And they said, "Yeah, no patents." And that was the end of our
Mm,
discussion. Um, so just because you can't
mm,
patent something doesn't mean that it's not important. Um, but
yeah.
that's why it wasn't developed into a, drug at that time. The other problem with oxaloacetate, and we had a heck of a time with this at the beginning, is, that if you take a jar of oxaloacetate and put it on the table, in a week, it will be gone, because it spontaneously breaks down into pyruvate, which is another metabolite, non-toxic, and carbon dioxide, which is, in the levels that you produce are also non-toxic. But even though it's non-toxic, it's not oxaloacetate. So that was a problem in working with this. And What we found is that oxaloacetate is actually made up of two different molecules. One is in a straight line, 4 carbons, so very small molecule, 4 carbons in a straight line. That's the keto version. Like I see your book Keto Flex behind you. Ha ha! The keto
Yeah.
version. And then the other one was in the enol form, which is the 4 carbons, and there's a double bond in there in the carbons. And the enol form is stable, and the keto form spontaneously just breaks apart. Uh, and there's an enzyme in the body that allows these two compounds to go back and forth and stabilize. It's called enoketotetramerase, another one of those weird words. And
Yeah.
that's great. And what it does is it allows more of this or more of this depending upon the pH where it's at. So, like in your lungs, the pH is different than in your stomach, which is different than in your bloodstream. And oxaloacetate kind of just reacts back and forth and stabilizes. So we thought, well, we'll just make it in the enol form. We'll synthesize it in a lab in the enol form so we can get the stable version. And in a week, it was gone. Um, hmm. Because what had happened is there was another catalyst that was present that allowed the enoxaloacetate to go into the ketoxaloacetate, and then the oxaloacetate was gone until it was all gone. And we found out that that catalyst was water. So just atmospheric water
Yeah.
coming into our product was enough to degrade it. So now we make it in an anhydrous enol form without water. We shield it from water with desiccant packs, and we seal the bottles. And in that way, we get a 2 to 3 year shelf life. We also found that
Wow.
the oxaloacetate could also be stabilized a little bit with ascorbic acid, which helped with stability. So we made a combination of oxaloacetate and ascorbic acid and put it into capsules. And then the question was, well, how much do you give people? Hmm. So we went back to the clinical trial work that was done in Japan, and because we were looking at using this as an anti-aging supplement, we wanted the lowest dose that was proven effective. And the reason we wanted to go with the lowest dose is because we figured people would be taking this the rest of their lives. And the way to reduce risk is to take the lowest dose that actually makes a difference. So in that trial, they did 100 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams. There were no problems with any of that. It all helped reduce fasting glucose levels. And so we came out with a 100 milligram dose product and put that in the market first in Canada, and then we brought it into the United States as a new dietary ingredient. So that's how we kind of got started
Yeah.
with the oxaloacetate. Pretty crazy story.
It is crazy and it's impressive. I love the commitment to stabilize it. And you developed the product Benagine, which is the one I'm holding up here for those watching on YouTube, which is the 100 milligrams of oxaloacetate. A couple of questions. Number one, ascorbic acid. Is there any concern with ascorbic acid and throwing off copper to iron ratio? Or is the amount in here not high enough to throw anything off?
It's a great question. At some of our lately, we've been using a much higher dose of oxaloacetate to look at disease states. This was a very mild nutritional supplement meant to keep healthy people healthy. In our disease state investigations, we go up to as much as 6,000 milligrams a day. And at that point,
Wow.
yeah, at that point, we omit the ascorbic acid entirely. Um, Most of the work we're doing now centers around 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams a day in clinical trials. But again, we leave the ascorbic acid out. But generally, 150 milligrams of ascorbic acid um, is not enough to really do anything unless you are very, very sensitive to vitamin C. And it's very rare, but it does happen occasionally. You know that if you drink like a glass of orange juice and you feel like terrible, so those people should not take this product. But it's very, very small. I mean, that's like, you know, one person per million or something like that. It's very small.
Yeah. Yeah, great to know. That was my thoughts exactly, that the amount in there is not enough to do anything negative, and the pros far outweigh the cons, especially with the oxaloacetate. Now, a lot of the people who are in my community, Alan, I call them the keto campers, are my amazing community. We do keto, we do a lot of intermittent fasting, and a lot of the reasons why people choose to do fasting is because of the benefits that you explain, the AMPK, the autophagy. So, can you speak on your product in relation to fasting? Would it be best to use it during a fast? Should you have it before a meal? Will it help with postprandial glucose? So, what's the best use for somebody who practices intermittent fasting?
The best use of oxaloacetate is to use it every day, because what we're trying to do there are two effects here. One is a pharmacological effect, and that's we can see that in reducing fasting glucose levels and also some mood issues that improve, and that happens almost immediately. But we're also shooting for genomic effects, which your DNA stays the same. It pretty much doesn't change. I mean, every once in a while there's a mutation here and there, but for the most part, your DNA is your DNA. And but what your DNA is expressing, these proteins, changes all the time, and it changes in response to environment. So, but before we understood this, there was a big concern. Well, is this because of environment or is this because of heredity? Well, it turns out they work together. Um, your environment actually changes the proteins that are expressed in your system and in your cells, and it's a big change. It's actually about 10% of the total genes that are out there change when you calorie restrict or when you do intermittent fasting or when you take a calorie restriction mimetic. So, in order to get those gene changes, these proteins are produced in very small amounts, and it takes a while to build the system to get those proteins and get them to the cells and whatnot. So typically we start seeing genomic responses in 30 to 45 days. So rather than when to take it and how to take it, just take it. Just take it every day. That's the secret.
Got it. 100 milligrams per day is a great dosage. Have you seen any research or have you done any clinical studies on taking it before a meal and it reducing postprandial glucose?
We have. I published some of that work a while back. What we see when when you take oxaloacetate on a daily basis is your glucose as baseline, your glucose fluctuations do this throughout the day. If you eat a big meal,
Yep.
your glucose levels go up, and then insulin's released, and your glucose levels go way down, and so you've got this normal swing. And in people that don't have diabetes, that swing is very moderate. With people with diabetes and some other medical conditions, the swing gets really high and then really low, and then really high and then really low. And that's a problem because when it's really low, you don't feel well because you don't have energy to do stuff, and your brain is screaming at you, I'm hungry. And when it's really high, that's not good either because it having that high amount of glucose that's circulating in your bloodstream, it hooks up with other proteins, glycosylation, I believe is the term. I'm not sure that I may have made a mistake there, but it's something like that. And
Advanced ages, advanced glycation end products. Yeah.
exactly, and that messes up all that work that your cells have done to make those wonderful proteins to run your body. And it's kind of a random thing. It's like a shotgun, Oh no, we've taken out this protein and we've taken out this protein. And over time, it causes a lot of damage. And that's one of the reasons why diabetics have, peripheral neuropathy and other issues that just get worse over time if they don't control their blood glucose levels. So, what we've seen with oxaloacetate is it increases the production of some genes that help to stabilize that, like the FOXO3A gene deals with glucose homeostasis. And when you take oxaloacetate on a regular basis, we were able to reduce the amount of swing through the day by 55%, which is pretty big.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that in diabetics or healthy individuals?
That happened to be in diabetics, and we in healthy individuals, what we see more is an increase in endurance. Um, so we have a lot of athletes that, including some Olympic athletes, that take oxaloacetate about 15 minutes before they compete, with about 100 to 200 calories of food. And the effect, the increase in endurance effect lasts for about 2 hours in normal people, and at that point they just take more if they're still playing. Um, and when you think about it, we did some tests on this with muscle cells at UCSD, and we mounted the muscle cells onto transducer plates that can measure the force of the muscle. And then we did the old frog legs experiment where you electrify the muscle and it ching, and you do that over and over and over again to this single muscle cell, and you can plot the force versus time, and for a while it just does the same thing. But then after a certain amount of time, the amount of force drops off, and that's when the muscle goes into fatigue. And interestingly, if we add oxaloacetate to the solution, we can make that muscle go into fatigue about 10% later. Now,
Wow.
you think 10%, that's not that much, but if you're in an athletic competition that is usually determined by less than a half a percent between the participants, especially at the very highest levels, a 10% increase in endurance is huge, which is why,
Game changer.
yeah, why we have a bunch of athletes that take this, and weekend warriors too.
That's super interesting. I want to transition, Alan, into a topic that is very popular in my community.
Mm,
So, the way that we teach keto and intermittent fasting is we view them as tools. We're not dogmatic about it. We like to practice keto flexing, that's my book, going in and out of ketosis, metabolic flexibility. Same thing with fasting. It's just as important to have the feasting and eating enough quality food. Now, one of the things we've seen is women who have a menstrual cycle the week before their period, they tend to struggle when they try to push it and do a lot of fasting and do a lot of keto that week before their period. And what we've educated them on is to increase their healthy carbs, to make some hormonal conversions, for a couple of reasons, progesterone and estrogen. But something that I came across with your work is part of the brain, the cerebellum that is requiring glucose, and that's part of the reason why they're experiencing craving. So I'd love for you to explain that a little bit, and then talk about your product Jubilance as a
Wow.
solution.
You have done a deep dive into us, and it's interesting that you've been getting those anecdotal reports from women. We we had some doctors that let us know that women who were taking Benadryl, um, their PMS went away. And being a guy, um, I said, "Oh, okay." And the doctor's like, "No,
Yeah,
you
right.
don't understand. These women have to hide for 3 days a month because if they're around anyone that they work with, they'll get fired." And I was like,
Mm,
"Really?" And we started looking into this and found out that um, this is a problem that's not talked about very much. And it affects about 20 to 30% of the population, depending upon how you define it, of childbearing women. And then of that
yeah.
population, 10% have something called PMDD, which is really very serious. They've got suicidal thoughts. They can't, they have to hide for a week or so, and this happens every day or every month since they were 13 years old, and now they're in their 30s. You can imagine what the quality of life is like. And so we started looking this and trying to understand what was going on. Um, Part of what we saw is there was a nice clinical trial done at UCLA that looked that did brain scanning uh, in women right at that time that they would be having emotional problems, and comparing them to women at the same time that just didn't have PMS and any of these emotional problems, and they saw a huge difference in the brains. Um, and typically in the past, we thought that PMS was due to hormonal issues because it happened every month and it happened at the same time, and you could put it on a calendar and say, "Oh, this is going to be a bad couple of days." Um, but it seems like the hormones help with the timing of things, but the actual problem appears to be linked to these brain issues. And what they saw is the women who had emotional issues, their cerebellum, the back of their brain, the kind of the lizard brain we used to call it, um, that's where they need more glucose. They you look at the PET scans and it just lights up like a Christmas tree. They are burning through so much glucose. So if you can give them glucose, all of a sudden they feel better, which is why these women are reaching for chocolate, why they're reaching for carbohydrates, because they just need more glucose at that time. And unfortunately, the way our bodies process carbohydrates and sugars is they break it down. You get this big rush of glucose through your system. Your insulin is released, and all of a sudden you go from very high to very low, and your mood gets even worse. So it works for about 15, 20 minutes, and then in a half hour, you feel so much worse than you did before. And instead, what the oxaloacetate's doing is it's going, you take it orally, it goes into the stomach, it goes first pass into the liver, and then oxaloacetate allows the conversion of fatty acids that circulate through your system into glucose. So you're actually able to make glucose at these times when you need it to feed your heart and feed your brain, especially during fasting. So this is really important because we see, and so we did a clinical trial in this. We didn't know what we'd see. If there was a 10% improvement, we thought, that would be pretty amazing, because a lot of these women are dealing with anxiety and depression and anger, and suicidal ideation. What we saw, and this was a placebo-controlled, double-blinded crossover trial where you start them off with the oxaloacetate and another group with placebo, and then you cross them over and see if there's differences. So top level trial, we saw over a 50% reduction in depression and anxiety,
Wow.
and a 48% reduction in suicidal ideation, which means
Wow.
this product is saving some lives. It's saving some lives.
That's that's amazing.
And
That's
and it's
so needed. And there's a lot of women who,
and it's all about glucose maintenance. It's all about, instead of doing this, doing this. And who would have thought, that longevity research would lead to a product that women are telling us that their lives are now changed. I would, it's amazing. The first month they try this, I'd get an email and they'd list out all the wonderful things that happened to them, and they didn't know it was coming, and they forgot about it, and their husband thought that they were wonderful. And the next month I'd get another email just saying it's still working. I can't believe it. Maybe this is the real thing because I've tried so many other things and nothing's worked. And then, like the third month, you'd get an email just like one line, send more. And that's what you want. You, with these women, it's such a big part of their lives, trying to manage their emotions, trying to manage that time period when they know things are going to be tough, when the smallest little things just seem like a huge burden to them. And to not have that, to have that freedom, to have that burden removed, uh, they just go on with their lives then, and that's a really wonderful thing.
yeah, it's absolutely amazing and wonderful because it improves their quality of life, not just them, but their relationships. To your point,
Oh, yeah.
they might lose their job if they were out of line, or got aggressive, or their relationships are improved. So the product is called Jubilant, and it's different than the Benadine. I take the Benadine. My fiance actually takes the Jubilant. And besides, that's a really fascinating study, by the way, that clinical study you just referenced. But besides that one, I know you've done a lot of clinical studies and you're still doing more.
Yeah, we're doing quite a
What
few.
has been the most surprising? Wow. And what has been the most surprising benefit you've seen from oxaloacetate?
Well, other than increasing lifespan in worms, it's too bad we're not worms. It we have no idea if oxaloacetate will increase human lifespan, because we don't know if calorie restriction will increase lifespan. We suspect it will, because in some of the trials that were done, we see a decrease in atherosclerosis, which is the number one killer in America. And if you just
Yeah.
decrease that, you should see an increase in survival. Um, so that's pretty big, but we don't know if it works for sure because, I mean, think about it. You'd have to do a 99-year test. I don't have that much time to wait.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe I do.
Now, are there things you can do, Alan, to measure cellular health with the oxaloacetate, like telomere testing, inflammatory markers? Like, what about that?
Um, well, interesting on telomere testing, as we get to higher and higher animals, like certainly that will increase lifespan in worms and some other creatures like that. You get up to like mice or rats, and increasing telomere length doesn't increase lifespan, because that's not the limiting factor, unless they have a chronic disease where they're turning over their cells a lot, and then telomere lengthening can be very helpful. But if you're normal, that's not the weak link at this point. It may be in the future as we figure out ways to increase lifespan. Um, as far as inflammation, um, we did some cellular work with oxaloacetate, and one of the things we found is that it can reduce uh, this one inflammation pathway, which is called NF kappa B, which is like a major inflammation pathway in your body. So if you turn that on, then what happens is this protein NF kappa B uh, translocates from the cytoplasm into the nucleus, and it opens up the chromatin, and it turns on the genes that uh, lead to the inflammation response. And that's very important because there are times that we need, like if you get COVID, or if you are in a car wreck and you need to do a bunch of repairs to your tissues, or if you're, just have a cold. Um, so it's a good thing to be able to do that. Some people don't turn that off, and that's a real problem. That it's like autoimmune issues, and things like we're beginning to think things like long COVID and chronic
Mm.
fatigue syndrome are related to that too, where they
This is also in relation to this like cellular it's the cells are in this cellular danger response, right? The
yeah,
mitochondria are essentially
yeah.
in
I
this
think
war
Bob
metabolism.
Bob Navio at UCSD came up with that
Yeah,
idea, and
exactly.
I was talking to Bob, and he said, I've been looking at oxaloacetate, Alan, and he said you need to talk to some of these people that are doing long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome, and here talk to
Mm.
Dr. David Kaufman. I said, okay. So I called up Dr. Kaufman and told him what we had going on, and told him about the fact that some of our customers had chronic fatigue syndrome, and they reported to me that oxaloacetate helped them get through their day. And he said, he's David's at the Center for Complex Disease, and he's also on, you know, advisory panel at Stanford and at Harvard for chronic fatigue syndrome. Smart guy, obviously. And
Yeah.
he said, have you ever, tried this at higher dosage in chronic fatigue patients, or long COVID patients? And I said, no, uh, not at super high doses. We've done some work in cancer research at super high doses, but he said, well, let's try it. So we tried it in a couple of his patients, and I don't know how familiar you or your audience is with chronic fatigue syndrome. It's again another one of
Very much so. Yeah.
it. No one really talks about it. There, according to the
Mhm.
Center for Disease Control, there are 2.5 million Americans with chronic fatigue syndrome. 2.5 million,
It's
and
awful.
you know, uh, so we put together a clinical trial, David and I, and we ended up doing about 120 people in high dosage oxaloacetate, and these were primarily women because women get it more often than men. There was like 76% women. Um, Average age was in the, like, late 40s, early 50s, I think, and, the length of time that they'd had chronic fatigue syndrome was, on average, 8.9 years. Years! Some of these patients had it
It's
for
awful.
30 years, and you can imagine
Jeez.
over a 30-year time frame, the number of things that they tried to make it better. Um, and so, you know, we didn't go into this trial thinking that we were going to see anything amazing, but we did. Um, we saw anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 milligrams of oxaloacetate a day uh, help these patients, that had it for many, many years. Within 6 weeks, the average reduction in fatigue was 25 to 30%. And
Wow.
that's life changing for these people. Some of them were super responders, where we tested them for fatigue and they tested normal, which, you do that for somebody who's had fatigue for 30 years. I, I had one guy that he, he felt so good. He went out and ran 5 miles. I was like, what are you thinking? Because a lot of times these people, if they overdo, then they crash and they're not
Wow.
good for a month afterwards. Post-exertional malaise is what we term it. And he said, "No, I don't have that." He said, "I feel great, and I wanna do it again tomorrow." I'm like, "No, no, just take it easy. Let's see how this is going." So we just submitted that information on both chronic fatigue syndrome, MECFS patients, and we also did an arm with long COVID patients. And a lot of
Mm.
people are starting to think that chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID are very, very similar, if not exactly the same. And we saw the same thing in long COVID patients, except that it was easier to treat them, probably because they haven't been sick for 30 years. And we saw,
Right.
I think, a 45% decrease in fatigue in 6 weeks with a lower dosage of
Wow.
oxaloacetate with 500 milligrams twice a day. Um, so we just got word this week that the Journal of Translational Medicine, which is a Nature Springer publication, is going to publish this probably within the next couple of weeks. I'll send you a copy and it'll be open access, so you can post it or your people can pull this up. And it talks about the clinical trial that we did, and it's so astounding that we said, okay, this was one trial, let's do another. So we hired the Bateman Horn Center in Salt Lake City to do another placebo-controlled, randomized, double-blinded trial of the oxaloacetate in chronic fatigue patients. And we're doing a lot of other things also. We're taking blood samples as the trial goes on, so we can see how their metabolites change. We've got a device on their ankle so that we can measure the amount of time that they're up or laying down. We're doing heart rate variability, so we're looking at that, and of course
Wow.
we're measuring fatigue through standardized, validated questionnaires like the Chalder Fatigue Score. And so that should be done by the end of the year. And then we've got another trial in MECFS coming up. Well, it's actually ongoing right now at Mount Sinai in New York City, where they're doing brain scans and they're trying to see the difference that oxaloacetate makes in these patients. So we've got a lot going
Wow.
on, and because of this important work, and because we established that patients with chronic fatigue syndrome have a shortage of oxaloacetate in their blood plasma, we can put out a medical food for these patients. We call it oxaloacetate CFS, and it's 500 milligram capsules in a 90 count bottle. So it's very, very powerful. And as a medical food, you have to have oversight from your physician. But it's giving some hope to these patients that haven't seen much in
Alan, that's amazing.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, that's absolutely.
and hopefully it works in the long COVID patients too, because I was just at a conference here in San Diego called Bio, which is a big conference, and they were talking. They were estimating the number of long COVID patients in the U.S. is somewhere between 8 to 12 million right now.
Wow,
Yeah, it's like
it's awful.
it's
Yeah,
like the zombies are here, and we don't know what to do with them.
yeah, and there's several in my academy that have long COVID symptoms. In my group of doctors that I work with, a lot of patients have it as well. So this is super fascinating and breakthrough clinical studies. And when you get that paper, yeah, please send it over to me, and we'll include it in the notes. For those of you who want to get Benagine and or Jubilance, which is your two products, we have it on our Revelation Health website, which is ketocampsupplements.com. So we'll put a link down below. Are you planning on working on any other new supplements, or are these the main one that you want to focus on? These
Well,
two.
this is it's kind of strange. I've been working with the same substance for 15 years, and we're still learning new stuff. It turns out that
Yeah.
oxaloacetate is a signaling molecule, and this has just been fleshed out over the last 2 years. It's not the oxaloacetate itself; it's the amount that's in your cells, and it changes metabolism. So when we, for instance, in cancer cells, when we increase the levels of oxaloacetate, it reverses something called the Warburg effect. Now, Otto Warburg
Yeah.
was this guy from the 1930s, German scientist, brilliant guy, and he found that most solid cancers exhibit this effect where they take in much more glucose into their cells and they burn that glucose not in the mitochondria, but they ferment it in the cytosol of the cell. And that produces a lot of lactate. Lately, we know that the lactate exports out of the cell and feeds other tumor cells, which is why it can grow without having a bunch of arteries feed it. And it also allows the cells to transport out of the area. So, having this Warburg effect makes tumors not only grow faster, but it makes them more lethal. And
Mm-hmm.
oxaloacetate, we've seen in a number of papers now, has been able to reverse that and shut that down. So we see tumors growing slower. We see them being less lethal. In our animal tests, the FDA gave us orphan drug designations for both liver cancer and brain cancer, and gave us a fast track status for glioblastoma, which is a really terrible
Wow.
brain cancer. So we're working with that, and we're starting up a clinical trial in that in about 2 months, and then we're already doing a clinical trial in breast cancer, primarily for fatigue, because the same thing that we're seeing in chronic fatigue patients, this change in energy metabolism, we want to change it back to normal and see if we
Yeah.
can't help people that have cancer, that have gone through chemotherapy, that no longer have cancer, but they're left with crippling fatigue and brain fog. We're trying to see if we can turn that around.
Super fascinating, and it makes total sense, the reference to the cancer, because if you look at Dr. Thomas Seyfried's work with the autophagy, the max autophagy, and the tumor shrinking, this helps is like the beginning process of that. So it makes total sense to me. I got two quick questions for you, and
Sure.
then we'll wrap up this awesome conversation. Number one, is this safe to give to pets? Like, can I give my dog a capsule of Benadryl, or maybe not?
Um, yeah, we actually looked at making a product for dogs because a lot of short-nosed dogs, die of brain cancer. I never knew that before, but, um,
Me
and it
neither.
turns out the approval process to do that is just as intense as approving a drug for human use, and very expensive. So we didn't move forward with it. But certainly in our animal trials, our animals live longer. So unlike most animal testing, you want to be on this drug.
Yeah, right.
And we had to look and do toxicity tests, and we did that with rats. And no, the rats ate it up, and we couldn't give them enough oxaloacetate to see any negative effects in them. So yeah, it
Okay,
would
that's
be
interesting. All right.
safe for pets, but we don't recommend it as a diet or as a nutritional supplement. We don't prevent, treat, or cure any disease.
Of course. Yeah, it's important to state. And last question for you, Alan, is what are you grateful for today?
I'm grateful that I've been on this journey that is now helping a lot of people. Um, we're finishing up an ALS trial right now because again, fatigue is a big thing in ALS, and I had one patient say to me, I used to have to take 3 naps a day, and now I don't have to take any, and, I was in the clinical trial with you, and I haven't felt this good in 2 years, and thank God, and you get one of those emails, and it just makes your day, and, I thankfully get a bunch of them.
It's amazing. Yeah, you're doing great work. My audience is blessed now because they just got this information. They're going to go get it and experience what all the benefits you're referring to. I want to acknowledge you, Alan, for the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you so much for being so committed to researching this amazing molecule. I'm grateful we connected, and I want to say thank you for educating us today on my show.
Thanks, Ben.